So I'm here today with Patrick Pearson of Pearson Alexander Technique, and soon to be, we've got a brand new brand coming in for you soon, which we'll talk about shortly. Okay. But Patrick, thank you for coming along and joining me today.
Ben, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no problem. So for those of you that don't know Patrick works with us here at the Centre for Integral Health in Shrewsbury, amongst a few other locations as well. And Patrick and I have known each other for over a decade now, I reckon it is.
Worrying that, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's been a very long time.
Yeah, I'm pretty impressed with the fact that after some of the very early conversations we had years ago in various health shows, that you and I are both still here, both still in business, and both continuing to grow.
I was about to say, both talking to each other.
Both talking to each other, yeah, that was a good start. And it seems that our paths become intertwined further and further as time goes on.
Further we go down the track, yes.
Yeah, sure. So for people that haven't kind of come across your work before, Patrick, give us a little bit of an introduction, how you started into what you're doing, and just give us a general synopsis of the kind of stuff that you cover.
Okay, my introduction to it was weird. That's the only word for it. It began at Wallingford Regatta in 1968, I think, 68 or 69, and I went to attract my dad's attention, who was sitting to my left, and whilst I looked the other way entirely. And the last memory I had of my dad was he had a cigarette in his right hand. Anyway, I caught that straight in the middle of my forearm, and ended up with a nice 8mm burn. Stung like hell, went a bit manky, and 7 to 10 days later was gone. The interesting thing about that burn was that there was this little blue zigzag across it because he put his cigarette in his mouth and put his biro where his cigarette had been. So actually I got caught by a biro and my body totally manifested every symptom of a burn.
Wow.
So the next year there was a magazine programme on the television about Alexander Technique, and they were talking about the idea that you can't separate the mind from the body when you're trying to help people with whatever needs that they have, either it's pain or whatever. And it's like I'm there saying, yeah, tell me about it, I know that one. And I promised myself then that at some point I would look at it. And the years rolled by, and eventually I found myself very early 1990s, probably 1990, on holiday in Cornwall, pouring down with rain for 12 and a half of the 14 days.
Sounds like Cornwall to me.
Yeah, that's Cornwall, blowing a gale. So my girlfriend and I wandered into this flea market in Padstow, and the first thing my eyes laid on was a book by Richard Brennan on the Alexander Technique. And I thought, I promised myself that. And at the time I was looking for a career change. I'd headed towards becoming a psychotherapist, and suddenly realised I thought to myself that I really didn't have the temperament for that work. I think now I've managed better, but at the time, there. And so I was in a quandary as to where to sort of take it. And I pretty much got halfway through this book and knew. It's like one of those awakening moments. It was just that crystalline and that clear. It's like, okay, this is what has to happen. So I went and took lessons, which was kind of interesting in itself. Found myself a course, and in fact was very fortunate in being taught by someone who was taught by Alexander himself.
Oh, nice.
And that was marvellous because people from all over the world flocked to that school because Elizabeth announced that she was going to retire, and so people wanted to work with her before that last connection to source disappeared. And so we had so much perspective. I mean, it was such a rich training. And at one point, we were doing table work with yours truly flat on his back, with a qualified teacher, one on my head, one on each arm, and one on each leg. And it's like trying to provoke me into responding and losing my Alexander. Part of being hysterical, it did have that, the gravity of it and the fun of it was just amazing. So yes, I was hooked.
Yeah.
Completely, totally.
Wow, so we're now coming close to a 30-year because being 2018 as we are now, that's nearly 30 years.
Yeah,
so that's really...
I've been seriously involved for 25 years, I suppose, and I'm about to close my 18th year of teaching.
Wow, beautiful. I mean, that's for those of you that are maybe not so aware of what it's like working in a complementary therapy space, that's quite a significant career to be looking at, and it's always a big up to be getting in there. So tell us a little bit as well for you, what Alexander Technique is about. What's the core of it for you?
For me, I love its empowerment of the individual. It is about that. It is a skill, even though therapeutically its scope is vast. It is about actually giving people the tools to help sort themselves out. When I think about that, it's a process of perpetual change, really, and it doesn't matter what you want to change with it. So you can go from being in pain to not being in pain. You can go from really struggling to move to moving really freely. You can go from being anxious to being really quite happy with it. And I think one of the things that possibly gets overlooked is that you can do something really, really well. And what Alexander Technique will do, if you start to steer it into the mix, is actually take you to the pinnacle of excellence that your human potential can possibly achieve with it. And indeed, it's I've put that to the test and proved it for certain people. It's like, yeah, okay.
So not a small scope, really, then. It's
massive.
Yeah, sure. Does that make it difficult for you to be able to with individuals, say to them, okay, well, this is what we can do, this is how we can help you? Do you find that there is some difficulty in people really understanding how Alexander can benefit them?
Yes, I think one of the difficulties is the marketing. I mean, if somebody walked up to you and said, I've got this thing that can do almost anything, what's your gut reaction? Because mine is, oh yeah, right.
Mine is, will it help my car go faster?
Will it help my motorbike go faster? I've actually tried that one and made it work.
Sure, yeah.
Or at least it improved my ability to corner faster on it. So it's like,
Sure.
hey, there you go.
Yeah.
It comes up against the buffers in its marketing. As I said, to say, it does so much, it seems far-fetched, actually. I think that's a reasonable thing to say. So it gets marketed for very specific things. For instance, we've had a clinical trial on back pain that was massively successful. Written up in the BMJ, doctors accepted it and said, no, right, this is good stuff then. Mm-hmm. And so to sort of give people something from it that they can relate to, we tend to sort of pick a string of specifics. What we can't seem to do is fill the gaps in between, so they actually know, well, actually, it's not just my back pain. And interestingly, a pupil of mine said to me recently, he said, I came to this to have my back pain sorted, which it did very quickly. He said, what surprised me is I wasn't expecting that it would change my life. And it's like, because it does, everything gets easier.
And so from that perspective, you've got a truly holistic type practice because it's able to have an influence in any area, any sphere of your life.
Yes. And the trick with it is not to judge it. It's like, okay, I've just got a result, and it's now, so where do we go from here? And just run the process again. Say, okay, has that moved on any? And be quite happy to sit there and not have an answer for a while, just as long as the questions keep coming. I remember Elizabeth saying this to me because she'd been in practice for 60 years when she was teaching us. I was 82 years old, going on 40. Just absolutely stunning. And I asked her, I said, do you feel that you've actually sort of got this weight off? She said, oh yes. But then again, no, it was the first 60 years that were the worst. And she then went on to say, it doesn't really answer things, but what it does is it lets you ask much, much better questions. So providing you're happy to kind of clock the benefits that you're reaping on the way, because you do, tremendous. For me, I mean, I changed shape. I got taller, I got broader, my lung capacity went up, and my sense of taste and smell improved, and emotionally I became actually a lot more sensitive. And it wasn't that I wasn't in the first place, but that sensitivity really kind of plugged in, but with a robustness. So although I had that sensitivity, I wasn't sort of upset by things going on around me. I could kind of sit there and sense them and feel into them without kind of ending up in a state or concerned or anything else. It's like, okay, I get that.
And as you know, with me, I've got a real thing for asking good questions as well, and I like to ask questions that really expand our awareness and our knowledge of ourselves and how we're interacting with the world. So to have a process that actually helps you to ask better questions just makes such a big difference to the way our lives are. It's a real gift. So I mean, one of the things that I know that you and I have talked about before is some of the things that Alexander is known for. So give us a bit of a rundown about, you mentioned the back pain, but what other stuff is really common with Alexander?
Really common. Everybody has got the idea that there is something to do with posture. Is that correct? You can't say it's not.
Sure.
Does people's postural behaviour improve as a consequence of it? Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And as the structures strengthen, poise becomes easier and freer, and you kind of see it in them. It's that thing that we call up. People, you look at them and think, oh yeah, they're definitely up. Energetically, they are up.
And do you think that's brought more from that change in awareness that people get, rather than from something like soft tissue manipulation, where we're physically manipulating a structure that will allow a change to happen? Do you think with Alexander it's coming more from the awareness?
Well, I quite approve of things that manipulate the physicality and help the structure change. The difficulty we got into as creatures, there are many responses we have to stress, to anxiety, to physical injury, and to habitual behaviours. And one of the things that really did upset us was learning to write. We took a pen and we learned to do this.
Sure.
And today we are going, which I'm not sure which of the two is worse, but it's that kind of collapsing down. The difficulty is that because we've done that for so long, the brain gets used to that and defends it.
Sure.
So sometimes if I've got somebody who's struggling and they've got like a tight spot, send them off to somebody who can do something physical with them and see if you can get some release. And before that release is taken over by their habit behaviour and put back exactly where it was before, we get some Alexander in there. So how the brain deals with it changes. So of course that can move on, and often the technique is perfectly good by itself to achieve just that.
Sure.
Sometimes it needs assisting.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy to, farm my pupils out to others if it helps them get over a difficult spot, or there's more benefit to be taken by teaming up with somebody to work with them rather than simply keep hold of them myself and keep going and thinking, oh, this is taking forever.
Sure. And this is one of the reasons why I like referring some of my clients back down to Patrick as well, because I know that once the release work is done, once some of the change work is done, I know that that's going to make a significant difference to them, but I also know that the habit is part of the reason why they're there.
They've got
and
the problem.
for that, Alexander, I feel, is a beautiful complement to a lot of the soft tissue work, because it's about changing that awareness for people.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So what other stuff is really...
giving them control, because it is teaching them to have control over it. Alexander doesn't do anything that nature doesn't do anyway. It's just faculties we don't use much.
Sure.
So all we do is teach them to drive it and exercise those faculties, and behold, we get a good result.
Yeah. So what other stuff is Alexander less well known for helping as well? What other stuff do you like working with and find some real benefit from with Alexander?
Well, in the early days, FM Alexander was known as the breathing man. Bear in mind, this work had its origins in voice. And for himself, his discovery was about trying to fix a voice problem, and this is way back when. And he first opened up in practice in 1894, so we've been around a while.
Sure.
So it can be hugely helpful if people have sort of breathing trouble, to raise the efficiency of somebody's breathing if they have things that sort of chew on them, like asthma or hay fever or whatever. To actually have the lung function working better is a huge help. If you're an athlete, the benefits are immediate and obvious. Curiously, in my early days, one of the things that happened to me, and I was rowing quite seriously at the time, so by anybody's general conventional yardstick, I was a fit person.
Sure.
But in the course of my lesson on Friday and my going to work on Monday morning, my work shirts didn't fit. It's like I couldn't do the buttons up in the middle. And you think, have they shrunk? So you throw one off and you pull another one out of the wardrobe, and it's like, no, that doesn't fit either. Nothing fitted. So I had to dress down on a Monday morning, which is sort of raised the odd eyebrow or two. But again, with one of my rowing pupils, who was a world medalist at the time, she upped her lung capacity by 1 litre.
Wow.
Now, for a world gold medalist, who you would say, yes, she's got to be fit, to find an additional litre, that's a huge amount.
Sure, and so much benefit for the body as well to have that extra exchange capacity as well.
Yes, it is that exchange. That's what we need, and that's what's good for us. So yeah. So breathing, pregnancy is one. In certain fields, it's well known. I bump into the occasional midwife who goes, "Oh, Alexander technique, wonderful." It's good for creating the elasticity that's needed. It helps sort of offset and prevent the heartburn that pregnant women sometimes get, the pain in the hips, and it actually does strengthen the pelvic floor and everything else. And the process, I'm told by sort of people who I've taught who've consequently given birth, that it actually sort of helped them through the birthing process. But of course, if we come back to the postural thing, it's the realignment afterwards, because while all that hormonal rushing around has softened connective tissue and all sorts, that sort of distortion that can take place postnatal, it helps to restore that in good alignment. And the sheer sort of good use of the structures when you're now lifting a newborn that's growing very, very quickly and putting on weight, really fast, to actually have a good lifting technique with the spine well engaged, basically strengthens and helps the body rather than tries to break it. So from that point of view, if anybody's thinking about it, if you start to plan a family, start your Alexander technique lessons then is my recommendation, but better late than never.
Yeah, sure, and really useful for me to know as well, because I hadn't been aware of the crossover and the benefit for people who are pregnant to have Alexander. But as you're talking about it, it's like, well, of course, it makes obvious sense for that. But sometimes kind of making those links isn't always so easy. So what else is Alexander less well known for as well?
Rehab. The brain tells lies. Basically.
Really well.
How do I put this, without sounding whatever I sound like? It's like, no, the brain tells lies. For example, if somebody has a leg amputated, one of the things the brain does is tells them they've got a painful leg there when there is no leg there. So what processes at work there? Essentially the brain is sending out its usual communication to that limb. It's not getting back what its habit tells it should get back, and therefore it gets confused, and in that confusion it will throw up an alarm. So, oh, okay, I'm going to defend you, because that's its first job. It's like, it sits in there going, I love you, I'm going to look after you, nothing's going to mess with you, everything's going to be alright. And that's its primary thing, to keep us well and to keep us alive and surviving. And so if it gets confused, that's exactly what it will do. Now, the difficulty with conventional rehab is that if you don't include the brain in the change, then all sorts of habits in the kind of in the drive to get up and moving quickly, mean that people end up with all sorts of quirky habits. And indeed, for things like stroke, or trauma, where somebody's had a car crash and a head injury or something, where the brain then doesn't actually have its full working capacity, then our business of actually reteaching the brain a different way, well, we simply teach the brain the way it needs to learn to actually help that on. And it's very effective. It's very effective.
Okay. So aside from the pregnancy, aside from the breathing and the kind of the pain conditions, the trauma conditions, what other areas does Alexander actually show benefits in as well? So what are the types of people that you like working with?
Well, sort of in that same field, prevention. The number of people over these years that I've been teaching who've come back to me and said, my consultant says I don't need the surgery. And it's like, yes. Hip replacements, knee replacements, and I had one young man who was threatened with the most god-awful spinal fusion that was going to put him on his back and out of school for 18 months. And Lord knows what state it would have left him in afterwards. Fortunately, his aunt was one of my pupils and said, before you let this happen. And it just took some teaching in. This is what happens with the body. And the last I heard of that young man was a couple of years back, who was then at university and 20 years old, and from not being able to stand properly and not be able to move around and all these difficulties he was having with his spine. Apparently he can take 80 kgs and press it above his head. So.
Wow. Quite a difference.
So that spine is working.
Yeah, sure. And without, fusion and rods and all the other nastiness that we've
things they're going to do to him, yeah.
Wow. No, that's good.
So that's, and that's hugely gratifying.
Yeah. So am I right in thinking as well that Alexander can be useful for performance enhancement in certain fields as well? Say a bit about that.
Absolutely. There's a reason that I'm not sure whether RADA and the Royal Academy actually still employ Alexander teachers directly, or whether they have them attached as associates. But certainly for years that certainly was the case. I think it still is. I think the Royal Scottish Academy and a lot of the conservatoires of music throughout Europe have an Alexander teacher hanging around somewhere. Because the more efficient you can make the use of the structure, if you're constantly repeating actions, that puts a strain. So the more you can take the strain out of that, the easier it makes it and the less inclined to injury, but also the performance goes up. And in the music teaching that I do myself, because I tutor people in the Great Highland Bagpipe periodically.
He's awesome at it as well. If you get a chance to catch Patrick on the pipes, it's great.
Yes, you'll probably not want to hear it too long, but hey, never mind. But and it is that encouraging things to move, and we can use, even without the hands-on of Alexander technique, there are wonderful ideas you can bring to bear just to wake the brain up to what this movement is and what that movement is and so on, that allows them to do what they do and progress with what they want to do. And so yes, musicians, actors, dancers, sports people, and horse riders. The German Olympic dressage team have an Alexander teacher on the staff. At least they did last time I looked.
Yeah, sure. I think it's interesting as well that so often there's not enough publicity of the benefits for people within these fields as to how actually a little bit of, I look at it as a combined kind of psychophysical emotional retraining can really change the performance. And yet if you go back kind of 30 years or so, it suddenly became a really big thing within sort of Olympic sports and in high-level sports to actually have mind training as well as body training. Yes. And Alexander's been talking about this for 100 years.
Yes, so, yes. I mean, in 1920 he was talking about the whole man. And it's like, really? Have we been saying this for that long? Yes, we have.
Yeah.
It is. It's 100 years as near as damn it, and it's like,
which is pretty impressive. So, I know that we've kind of concentrated a lot on the Alexander work so far, but that's not all you do. So, tell me a bit about some of the other stuff that you do within your therapeutic practice as well.
Well, I'm moving over from sort of the Alexander technique by itself to adding other modalities. I've always believed that if I am to do CPD, not only must I do my Alexander CPD, but where good ideas are coming up, to actually take an interest in what other people are doing. And because I've kind of engaged with that over the years, I've ended up partly qualified in quite a few things. And so now I'm finishing those qualifications off. And the first one I started with was access bars, which I just love to bits. It sits very comfortably with Alexander's philosophy, because at the end of the day, Alexander is about actually helping people to be present and to make choice, and to make choices that improve their lot. And that's kind of access bars for me, really.
In a nutshell, isn't it? Sure, what can we do that'll change the way you do things so you choose better?
Yes, and just make it easier. Yeah. And that whole thing, if you think in the technique, what we're doing is we're not actually teaching humans to do something that they didn't do beautifully at the age of 3. Yeah. We're getting rid of all those ideas that have interfered with it, restricted it, put limiters on it, and just restore them to what nature intended. So that getting rid of the interference and that thought that actually how much information our brains take on, that's really got nothing to do with anything much, quite often, or it's actively interfering and as you say, causing us to make poor choices, etc., etc. And if you can do that, and bars is such a simple and straightforward way to do it, it's just delicious.
It really is. And for those of you that have not come across the bars before, it's a very simple process, 32 points on the head that we lightly hold for a period of time, and it helps to just change the way the neurology in the brain is running. And there's now neuroscience reviews that show that it changes neuroplasticity and the neuromapping within the brain, and also a recent pilot study that shows that it reduces anxiety and depression 82 and 84% respectively, which is pretty exciting stuff. So really nice to bring, really nice to kind of then bring that in and do that as well.
Yes, indeed. Because I think one of the, if you were to ask me, does Alexander technique fail? No, it doesn't. It's people sometimes do not get a result, and that's because usually they don't do the work.
Sure.
Yeah. It's like, if I ask you to do this and you haven't done it for 3 weeks, it's like, what do you expect? Yeah. But sometimes, I don't think we should be too harsh about that, because we do live in a world that's wickedly demanding. And one of the things with Alexander is finding that place of stillness, because it's in that stillness that we can get in there and start to make the choices and make the change. But if you're constantly bombarded every which way you turn, that gets to be really, really tough. Mm-hmm. And that begins up here, and I think that's one of the things that really excites me about bars, is that you can shut all that nonsense down. Yeah. Just get rid of this. Fabulous. Let's do this some more. And so, in the future, when I find people, if they're struggling a bit because they are in that high stimulus, random energy, this is all interfering and I'm having a hard time with it, I will suggest to them that they come and have a bar session and let's clear that, and then we'll carry on with the Alexander.
Yeah, and it's a perfect little synergy between the two, because you're extending the choice, the awareness through the Alexander teaching, but then you're just helping to wipe the slate a bit clean, so it's a bit easier.
So it's a bit easier to achieve, yes.
Yeah. And I also understand that you teach non-violent communication as well.
That I do. It's interesting. I suppose in my 20s I invested in my mental health. I'm so pleased I did, really. When you look at how tough relationships are in this modern world and everything else. I did some coursework over a period of years. It was all about relationships, and how it began with how men actually relate to themselves as creatures. It then began, the next sort of section of that was how men relate to each other, and then it finally finished on how do we relate to women. And so the girls who were on that final course had gone the same route, and we had just tons to talk about, and there was and it was obviously guided, and it was also therapeutic with some very qualified people. Fabulously enlightening. And for me, NVC, nonviolent communication, seemed to be a vehicle that moved on from that base. And interestingly, it was the brainchild of a guy called Marshall Rosenberg, who'd been brought up in this pretty rough area. And he'd studied why, people pull out guns and knives. And when they were in dialogue, for want of a way to say it, that there was a framework, and it was based on particular ways of using language. And he also looked at people who were good at what they do in communication terms: therapists, litigators, teachers, clinicians, anybody who was really good with it, and realised that they had a pattern too. And so he devised this method of being able to go from one to the other. Interestingly, MVC came to me with my Alexander Teacher training. We actually had a module, because the training took 3 years. And so we looked at other things. Neurodevelopment delay therapy was a module that we looked at, because that bumps up against our work sometimes. But yes, MVC. And it comes back to that. Just give yourself that kind of space. Stop before you open your mouth, and then actually proceed from a better place. And that better place comes from observing rather than judging. I listened, oh Lord, when was it? Last week. Some poor guy in Tesco's car park was having his ears torn off by this woman. And I'm not judging whether he'd set himself up for this or whatever it's about it, but one of the things that struck me about it in this tirade that went on for as long as I was in earshot, I heard her in that time say nothing that he was able to identify that he could respond to change that situation. So it's like people say, oh God, you're useless, you're just terrible. Well, what can you do about that? If she said, if what you heard is, John, you've just broken the car key off in the door lock, now we know what we're talking about. And so from that sort of being much, much more specific, and that was one of the things that related back to the psychotherapeutic work I'd done, is the fact that when we talk, we don't actually say what we mean.
Yes.
So often and people, if you don't believe me, just eavesdrop on conversations when you're out and about and say, what is that person actually talking about? And most of the time, it's actually quite difficult to figure out. And at the end of the day, once you get specific, then all you have to do is ask for what you want, and usually you will get somebody's cooperation. By the time you sort of verbally battered them around the head, nobody wants to cooperate with you. Why would they?
And this is where it beautifully all runs in together with the access consciousness work.
And the Alexander.
No judgment. Yeah, sure. So it's beautiful. And I know as well, this has also stimulated a rebranding for you as well, isn't it? So you're just in the process. Are you happy to share a little bit of the rebrand and talk about what's coming up?
Surely. Well, it actually kicked off, I think, as a consequence of starting bars work and actually having my bars run. That just to move into things with questions rather than presuppositions, and the question to myself was, what do I need to know, change or do or receive that moves this on? And it was just like somebody said, oh well, light bulbs pinging on left, right and centre. And I thought, well, there's all this stuff you know about. You've been using it for yourself for quite a while, so your experience and foundation is pretty sound. Why not finish the qualifications off and do it? And so that's what's happening.
Beautiful, I love that. So we're looking forward to seeing, because there's a new website in the offing and new Facebook stuff, and so we're going to see a whole bunch of stuff coming out over the next couple of months, and, and that'll be beautiful. But in the meantime, if people want to get in contact with you, or they want to learn more about any of the services you're offering, how can they get hold of you?
Through the Centre website.
So that's Centre for Integral Health, and that's integralhealthshrewsbury.com if you're looking for the website, or it's Integral Health Shrewsbury on Facebook.
Or you can contact me through my website, which is www.pearson-alexandertechnique.co.uk. It's a little dated now, but it's being changed, but the contact form still works, so you can get me through there. I do offer for Alexander Technique, because it's a little bit strange, a free 40-minute consultation if people want to come and chat about it, just to see if it's up their alley or not. Because I don't want to take people's money if they get there and think, oh God, this is just too weird. Or however it strikes them. I'd rather we organise that first before we got to that place. And if you need to call me at 07964 628 012.
Brilliant. So thanks, Patrick. Really appreciate you coming in and having a chat today, and it's really helped me actually to just learn a little bit more about some of the nuance and subtlety involved in Alexander teaching. And I love the coming together of these different parts of your system into this new integral model that is awakening for you in a much more overt way as well. I know it was already there, but not in quite so much of a direct way.
It's not quite so up front. Yeah. No, it's coming up front for sure.
Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Patrick, and have a great week, and hopefully we'll hear more from you soon.
You too. Thanks.